Shalom. I am Rabbi Nathan Davidovich, speaking to you from Efrat, Israel, on behalf of the webyeshiva.org. This week, we read two different Parshot in the synagogue on Shabbat. It's a double portion, Matos Maasei. We are getting close to Tisha B'av, and Tisha B'av, of course, commemorates the destruction of our holy temples in Jerusalem and gives us the opportunity to do some introspection before we get to this fast day, which ultimately, with God's help, will turn into a great holiday. We must think about where we are in our lives and what are our priorities. These two parshot give us an interesting insight on that. First of all, the second of the parshot, Maasei, which happens to be the last parsha in the book of Midbar, in the book of Numbers, before we go into Devarim, talks about the battle uh, and the victorious uh, events that took place with God's help over our enemies. And there's an interesting statement that is said in the Parsha of Maasei. It says, "V'horashtem es oretz v'yeshavtem ba." You will inherit the land and you shall dwell in it. Ki lechem nasati es oretz l'reshes atam, because I am giving you this land of Israel, to live in. And the Ramban says that what this means is this is a positive commandment of living in Israel, a positive commandment of the Jews to live in Israel. It's not just a place where the Jews are, it's a place of holiness. It's a place where God commanded us to live. When Theodor Herzl was trying to find a place to solve the Jewish problem, he thought, well, maybe we could move to Uganda. It wouldn't matter if all the Jews in the world lived in Uganda or any other place. There is not the holiness of Eretz Yisrael. There is not the holiness of living in this land. And the concept of that as a positive commandment means that, as the Ramban says, with very little exception, a person should not even leave the land of Israel, uh, except for some very limited exceptions. How much more so should we try to live in the land of Israel? We have a lot of excuses why many of us can't live in Eretz Israel. But look at the Ramban on this particular sentence, and you'll see the importance of living in Eretz Israel. Now, backing up to the parsha right before, there's an interesting colloquy between the tribes of Gad and Reuven. And the tribes of Gad and Reuven come to Moshe, and they say to Moshe, this land of Israel that God has given to us, this is, God has conquered for us. This is a land uh, that is good for cattle. And we have a lot of cattle. And they were talking about before they entered into the land of Israel. They're talking about the other side of the Jordan. And they say, it would be a great favor for us if you give us this land on the other side of the Jordan, and don't make us go into Israel to cross the Jordan. And Moses, of course, was astonished. He says, "What?" He says, "You want to stay here, and your brothers will go to war?" And they said, "No, no, no. We'll go to war with the children of Israel, but then we'll come back, and we want this land as our land." And then they said a very interesting thing. Vayagishu elav Vayomru, they came up to Moses and they said to him, Gidros tson nivne lemiknenu, hov orim laptapenu. We will build sheepfolds, places to keep our flocks here in this land, and then we'll build towns for our children. And it says, then they say, "V'anachnu nechlatz chushim lifnei bnei Yisrael ad asher im habionim el makomam v'yoshev tapenu b'orei mivtzer mipnei yoshvei oretz." They said basically, we will we will go with you. We'll fight the wars until the people of Israel are established in Israel, and then we'll come back and uh, live on this part of the Jordan. And it says, we won't return. We won't return until everybody has their appropriate portion in the land of Israel. We just want ours on the other side of the Jordan, not in Israel. And what was Moses' answer to him? Remember, their statement to him was, we want to stay here because it's a great land for cattle, and we want to build uh, cattle corrals, places to keep our cattle, and cities for our children. And Moshe gave an answer that made them think, should have made them think about priorities. And what did he say to them? He said, B'ni lachem orim letapenu, build cities for your children. V'gidras letzonechem vayotz mipichem tasu, and then build places for your sheep, for your flock to stay, and then I'll do what you have asked. Moshe was telling them that your priority shouldn't be your cattle. Your priority shouldn't be your possessions. Your priorities in life should be your children. How often do we forget about our priorities and be concerned with, as Gad and Reuven were, with, with their wealth, with Parnassa? How many of us sacrifice the time that we should be spending with children, be spending with family to make a living? How many of us work early morning to late at night and barely see our children? Dr. Twersky tells a story about a child, 13-year-old child, who went up to his father, and his father happened to be a psychiatrist. And he said, how much do you charge for an hour of your time? At that time, it was many years ago. He said, about $150 an hour. He says, good, I have $150. Would you please spend an hour with me? Priorities. Because of the lack of priority, what happened when the temples were destroyed and the children of Israel were exiled from the land? The first to be exiled, the first to be driven out of the area was Gad and Reuven, because they didn't have their priorities set. As we approach Tisha B'av, we have to take these messages to heart. We have to recognize that living in the land of Israel is a land of holiness. It's like living within the Holy Ark. And that is an important message for all of us. I know some of us find it very difficult to make Aliyah, to come to Eretz Yisrael, because of the Parnassa. Well, if you remember, you know, whatever Parnassa we make, whatever livelihood we make, is determined by God. God can give you a livelihood here as well as there. But most important is to recognize what is important in our lives. Our children, our families should be most important. And as we approach this holiday of Tisha B'av, hopefully it will be a holiday and not a fast day. Let's think about that and let's work on improving ourselves. Thank you for listening on behalf of the webyeshiva.org. I wish everybody a wonderful Shabbat, a Shabbat where we take in the light of Shabbat and appreciate the fact that God has given us the ability to make proper choices in our lives. Shabbat Shalom.